Welcome to part 4 of the new imperialism. Now we're going to talk about a splendid little war. Now, it might be an overstatement to say that William Randolph Hearst caused the Spanish-American War, but it certainly isn't an overstatement to say that he influenced it, right? For him, it all centered around what was going on in Cuba, the Spanish territorial possession. Cuba had everything Hearst wanted in a plot line to sell newspapers, right? It was an oppressed colonial possession that had had insurrections that had been brutally put down in both 1868 and 1895, right? There were tales of corruption. There were bad guys. There were villains, right? The lecherous, bloodthirsty Spanish officials and army officers. There were victims, the poor, innocent Cuban women and children. And then, of course, there were heroes, right? The New York Journal's reporters and, of course, their altruistic publisher, William Randolph Hearst. Okay, so in 1897, he sent a journalist named Richard Harding Davis and an illustrator named Frederick Remington down to Cuba to spin this righteous crusade to help drum up support for a call for the liberation of Cuba and possibly even American involvement, right? The men arrived down there in 1897 and just didn't really find a whole lot going on, right? When Hearst published a story saying that his budding reporters had arrived and had made contact with the Cuban insurgent army, Davis was outraged because he had not seen anything like this. He sent a telegram back to Hearst saying, I have not heard a shot fired or seen a single insurgent. Sir, I am just not in it. And Frederick Remington, he hated Cuba. He was from the north. He's not used to the climate of Cuba. He just wanted to be anywhere but there. Couldn't stand it, right? Just wanted to go home. And so finally he went to Havana and he telegrammed to Hearst. He said, look, everything is quiet. There is no trouble. There will be no war. Hearst will send a telegram back to Remington saying, please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war, right? Well, in the summer of 1897, gold fell into the lap of William Randolph Hearst to really just sell a ton of papers. Well, more specifically, Evangelina's Cosio y Cisneros, right? Or as William Randolph Hearst will refer to her, his Cuban Joan of Arc with long black hair. So who is this woman? Well, Evangelina is an 18-year-old Cuban girl who had been thrown in jail as an insurgent, right? She had been arrested. A Spanish officer supposedly had made advances towards her, advances that she responded to by kicking him in certain parts not worth mentioning, right? And so as a result, she was thrown into a deep, dark dungeon there in Cuba, okay? So this is perfect for Hearst, right? You've got the victim, the heroine, the young 18-year-old Cuban girl. You have the lecherous, sex-crazed Spanish colonel who had made advances to her, on her, right? And so Hearst telegraphed the plight of poor Evangelina and printed stories about her in the paper and began creating a drive to drum up support for her immediate release from her lecherous captors. And hundreds of people responded to this, right? Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, signed a petition for her release. So did the widow of former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And even the president's mother got involved in trying to demand the release of Evangelina from her Spanish captors, right? Now, when it became apparent that the Cuban government was not going to release Evangelina, Hearst even went so far as to hire an adventurer and a journalist by the name of Carl Decker to attempt to rescue her. This is no big heroic, guns a-blazing rescue, though, because Carl Decker goes to Cuba with something very important and powerful to help him get Evangelina's release. He has William Randolph Hearst's checkbook. He literally, through well-placed bribes and kickbacks, secured her release, right? He greased the wheels of bureaucracy, if you will, and she was released to his custody, and he very quickly spirited her out of the country. She was brought to New York City, where she was given a ticker tape parade in New York City. That had to be really weird for her, right? It's like, what is all of this? Because what does she know? She knows that she's in a prison cell. She doesn't know about this huge crusade in America to free her. And Hearst was quick to trumpet his success with a headline that stated, "An American newspaper accomplishes in a single stroke what the red tape of diplomacy failed to bring about in as many months." This brought so much attention, though, to the issue of Cuba and the Spanish colonial occupation of it, that McKinley finally started to have to do some kind of action, right? He had to have some kind of show of force or show of presence that he's keeping an eye on what's going on there. So on January 11th, 1898, the McKinley administration didn't just take notice, they took action. They sent a U.S. naval vessel down to Havana to sit in the harbor and just keep an eye on things. So William McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American interests and keep an eye on things, right? And then finally, an incident happened that just played perfectly into William Randolph Hearst's lap as far as beating the war drums goes. At 9:40 p.m. on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine in Havana Harbor exploded, right? It was a huge explosion. Of the 354 sailors on board the ship, 268 of them were killed. Only 200 bodies were ever recovered, and of those 200 bodies, only 76 were ever identified. I mean, this was a massive, massive explosion. On March 28th, the United States Naval Court of Inquiry released its initial findings on what they believe happened to the Maine. And they said that they believed the Maine had been destroyed by a submerged mine. A Spanish mine had blown the ship up. Well, this is clearly an act of war, right? Now, modern scholarship and later scholarship has determined that the most likely cause of the explosion in the Maine was some kind of accident that ultimately led to the forward powder magazine exploding, right? And there's a few different theories on it, but ultimately they believe that the explosion happened from the inside of the ship, which means it didn't happen from a torpedo or a mine, right? But that's neither here nor there. At this time period, everybody's blaming it on Spain, and perception beats reality every single time, right? So the explosion was perfect for Hearst. He begins reporting on this. He begins offering a $50,000 reward for anybody to find the perpetrators responsible for the dastardly outrage of the explosion on the Maine, right? So in late March, McKinley is going to send an ultimatum to Spain demanding that Cuba be given independence, right? Now, Spain doesn't want to react to this. They just want to stall for time so that maybe they can muster up support from other European powers, or maybe just this whole thing will die down, right? But McKinley keeps pressing, and so does the American press, right? That's not why they're called the press, right? On April 11th, 1898, President McKinley asked Congress if he could have authority to intervene directly with U.S. military forces on behalf of Cuba. The response was passing what was known as the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment, passed on April 20th, 1898, gave the president the authority to declare Cuba free and independent, authorized him to demand that Spain withdraw all its forces from the land and all its naval forces from Cuban waters, and also to use U.S. forces if necessary in order to ensure that this happens. But there was one little disclaimer here, right? It also claimed that the United States government was only fighting for the independence of Cuba and not for the establishment of a colonial control over Cuba, right? So the Teller Amendment gave the president authorization to take action against Spain to get them out of Cuba. When the Spanish heard about this on April 23rd, 1898, Spain responded to the Teller Amendment by officially declaring war on the United States. 2 days later, on the 25th of April, 1898, McKinley got Congress to approve an official declaration of war on Spain. So now the two nations have declared war on each other, and we have that splendid little war, as Teddy Roosevelt would call it, and that William Randolph Hearst had desperately wanted. So we have war now between the United States and Spain. That's great, right? Except the problem here is the United States in 1898 is not ready to fight a war. Remember, I mentioned in the 1890s, the United States Army was less than 30,000 men, right? Meanwhile, Spain, at least on paper, had a lot larger army. They had 150,000 troops just in Spain. They had another 150,000 troops in Cuba, 20,000 troops in the Philippines, 8,000 troops in Puerto Rico. But fortunately, the United States was very quick to build up its army. Matter of fact, they began drawing in volunteers as quickly as they could. One group of men that volunteered called themselves the Immunes. This was a group that recruited 10,000 men, a 10,000 man force that were presumed to have a immunity from tropical diseases. They'll call themselves the Immunes. They'll be rolled in the U.S. Army. They'll be ultimately sent to Cuba, where most of them will come down with malaria and yellow fever. You'll also have the Assistant Secretary of the Navy resign and start recruiting some people on his own. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he, with the help of a colonel named Leonard Wood, will form the first U.S. volunteer cavalry. Colonel Wood will be the commander of it, and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt will be the second in command. These are more commonly known as the Rough Riders, right? They will form basically what these guys are going to do is they're going to find anybody, any man that they can find that was either a former policeman or polo player or cowboy, anybody who had experience riding a horse. Recruit them and train them. They got rolled into the U.S. Army and sent to Cuba, most of them without their horses because they couldn't actually find transport for the horses. So ultimately, when we talk about the Rough Riders and their famous charge up San Juan Hill, which we'll talk about a little bit later, there's some problems with that too. They were really the rough walkers.